One of the sort of failure modes is potentially when your notion of assistance or cooperation
Right.
is this essentially sycophantic one, right? Where an AI chatbot or whatever is a yes man and just goes along with whatever you say or whatever you think is best and doesn't really question your beliefs or your values, right? I think some people, upon encountering these ideas of AI alignment, has like recognized the sort of structural similarities to the problems of misaligned capitalists, essentially, right?
Unconstrained capitalism does have some of these contradictions. Therefore, we need to do something about it, but never necessarily getting at the roots of capitalism as being the problem.
Your like little AI lawyer or whatever it is that gives you legal advice, right? Or one that helps you do shopping or whatever it is. And one that maybe even, if these things get good enough, that helps you do research on which local politicians you should vote for and recommends them, right? Like, oh, we're just going to have a single human giant AGI thing that's the first superintelligence, and we're going to align it to all of humanity's interests. And it's like, what is that? It's not implausible to me that we have decentralized AI organizations in the future, because they're not beholden to that, can take the risk of enacting in that kind of moral and political activism that humans routinely undertake because we want to see a better, more just world.
This episode is sponsored by NIM, the world's most private VPN that protects your internet traffic and metadata. Unlike traditional VPNs, NIM uses a decentralized mixnet to scramble your internet data, hiding who you're talking to, when, and how often. You can switch between full mixnet mode for maximum anonymity or a faster VPN mode for everyday use. Pay in crypto or fiat, and even your payment stays anonymous thanks to ZK-powered anonymous credentials. Take back control of your online life at nim.com. Sign up today using the code BlockchainSocialist and get an extra month for free.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and for this episode, I have Tan Zhi Xuan. She is an assistant professor in the National University of Singapore's Department of Computer Science and runs the Cooperative Intelligence and Systems Lab, which is focused on scaling cooperative intelligence via rational model-based AI engineering. So in case you guys missed it, artificial intelligence, it's everywhere now. This past year, it's kind of taken over a lot of the discourse, and part of that discourse has always been kind of like, I think, being afraid of what AI is going to bring about into the world, into the economy, and I think, feeling that and I think many people have, that like we're just not prepared at all as a society for what AI can potentially bring. And so kind of in my explorations around AI, I came across Xian's class, CS6101 at the University of Singapore, called Rational Approaches to Cooperative Intelligence, that I found super interesting and fascinating to think about. What does this technology mean if we are, I think, pursuing kind of like the less dystopian form of AI and think of it as something that is cooperative with humans rather than this kind of Rocco's basilisk, I guess, type of dystopian fantasy where AI is going to kill us all because it doesn't need us anymore. So with that introduction, Xian, I wonder if you could kind of introduce yourself as well, and why pursue this kind of work of cooperative intelligence, how you see it, what got you into it, and what exactly is cooperative AI. I think kind of one of the things that we were talking a little bit beforehand is that I think in this particular moment, there is like a very strong cleavage where some people are extremely anti-AI. If you use it even a little bit, you are maybe morally, ethically questionable and not thinking about society as a whole. And then on the other side, you have people who fully embrace it, whether that's in a nihilistic way, whether that's in a simply it's useful for me way. But yeah, I'm curious what brought you to this work, and you can explain a bit what is cooperative AI.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me here, Josh. It's really great to be talking to a set of folks really interested in, I guess, how, technology doesn't have to just empower the people who are already rich and powerful, but hopefully also empower like all people. And that is, for me, I think one of the important aspects of what I see as cooperative AI, even though that has many other dimensions as well. So, but a bit about me first. So yeah, I'm Shen, currently assistant professor at NUS in Singapore. I'm a Singaporean. I grew up there, but I did my undergrad and PhD most recently at MIT, graduated quite recently. And over the course of the PhD, I ended up working on this set of research questions that I'm now continuing to work on in my new lab, right? And basically, back when I started, or even right before I started my PhD, AI was still kind of niche, right? It certainly didn't have the kind of cultural and economic impact it's having now. But even back then, almost like 10 years ago now, people were starting to worry about the possibility of extremely advanced AI systems that were basically under the label of super intelligence. And I encountered some of those ideas in undergrad, and without necessarily being convinced that this was the future, right, or how soon it would be, because back then people didn't think it would happen even as fast as it I think has happened recently. I became, the people writing about this, people like Nick Bostrom and various other people associated with effective altruism and online rationalism, were worried about this becoming a really impactful for the trajectory of human civilization. Because if you did have, more superhuman intelligences in society, in our economy, that would, minimally change things, change our economically drastically, but potentially even, take over the world. And that's something I guess we'll discuss a little bit more later. But I think the central question then coming from that community was like, well, one way to stop this is maybe we need to align AI systems with human values. We need to get them really understand human values well enough to reliably promote them. And that was his question, just kind of from like me being a philosophy nerd perspective, was really interesting to me, because asking that question in the computational terms, like, was just, I think, fascinating. Like, how is it that humans learn human values was something I became quite interested in, sort of independently of beliefs about whether AI will take over the world. And that's sort of started me down this direction of, okay, like, how could we begin to sort of formulate a computational theory of learning human values and learning to basically work with other humans. And this is what ties it into cooperation, right? I think part of why humans have values and have notions of like what you ought or ought not to do, right, is so that we can live together with each other, right? And so that's eventually evolved into sort of like a perspective around, okay, if we want to make sure AI can live in a world together of humans and together potentially with other AI systems, then they need to learn to cooperate, right? So I think that's sort of my entry point into sort of what I think of the research I'm doing now, cooperative AI.
I can imagine the kind of like the retort of from an AI hater about cooperative AI as sounding like, I mean, basically that we already have that in some way where, I mean, I don't know if you've seen kind of like some of the latest South Parks about AI, where AI is kind of seen as this like yes man, they're always saying like, oh, you're so smart. That's such a good point. Great job. Like when people interact with like these LLMs, that tends to be like, that is what happens. And I think that probably has something to do with like the AI psychosis stuff as well. As maybe a whole other thing to go down. But maybe what you're saying, I guess the way that I'm kind of like maybe reducing it in a metaphor is cooperative AI is almost like, thinking about an AI Pokemon, where AI is instead kind of a little guy that helps you out and helps you do tasks and go about your day without necessarily detracting from things. Yeah, is that
Yeah.
is that a good metaphor? AI as a little Pokemon, or
Yeah, so I think that is one thing that you could want to do if AI systems are able to cooperate with humans, right? I think one pretty, I don't know if to call it dominant, but certainly very prevalent and certainly very visible form of AI technology that we're seeing today, of course, are AI chatbots, and or I think of them as AI assistants, right? And the sort of like
right.
as a product, because AI as a technology is much richer than just a particular chatbot product. Is the sort of the way that these things are sold is precisely to help you with daily tasks, right? To help you, any question you have, you can ask a question, it'll answer you. Any life situation, a life problem you might want to go to it can help you figure out how to do things, or maybe it'll just help you to do tasks altogether. And this is where we're starting to get into sort of more recent, different kind of product of AI agents, which like where you tell it to do things and it'll go about it for you. And I do think that is one aspect of cooperative AI, right? Certainly how to design better, more reliable, more trustworthy AI assistants or AI agents that do work on your behalf or promote your values or promote your interests is an important part, I think, of cooperative AI. I don't think that there are sort of both good and bad aspects of that kind of technological use case. But I do think one of the sort of failure modes is potentially when your notion of assistance or cooperation
Right.
is this essentially sycophantic one, right? Where an AI chatbot or whatever is a yes man, right? And, just goes along with whatever you say or whatever you think is best and doesn't really question your beliefs or your values, right? But even within that realm, I do think there's possible to think like, well, what would, say, a good human personal assistant do? Or perhaps relatedly for some of the other, different kinds of use cases that people do, like what would a good therapist actually say to a human, or a good friend actually say? And they don't, they aren't just yes men, right? They aren't just yes people, right? And, I think a good friend really tries to look out for your best interest, right, to some degree. And if that means pushing back on, self-destructive behavior or misguided beliefs or whatever it is, right, I do think that's an important part of, the sort of cooperative endeavor that you might call friendship as well. And you could imagine having, I don't think it's in principle impossible to have AI systems that play some of those roles as well, whether or not we want them to. I think in principle it's technologically possible. And it's a separate question, of course, is whether the companies deploying these products will be incentivized to do that versus deploy more sycophantic systems, right? So that's, I think, the response to this, idea of like everyone having their own AI Pokemon thing. I do think cooperative AI is also a lot richer than that, right? Because I think there's cooperation at the scale of a single human interacting with a single AI system, and that's, I think, the predominant form of interaction we're thinking of these days with AI systems. But as someone who thinks that fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, it's probably I don't know. I think right now there's a lot of reason to worry, but that AI technology will keep progressing. What's going to happen then in that future is that AI will begin to AI systems will play more and more roles in the economy, right? And sort of like play more, take on more roles as economic actors, empowering various existing economic actors, right? So if we end up in a world where a large number of different actors with different interests, right, and that's a sort of characteristic feature of the world, are empowered by AI systems, right, then this can create new problems that we haven't faced before, right? New problems of conflict, new problems of exploitation, new problems of just not managing to coordinate with each other well and causing problems for all of us, right? And I think that is also a super important problem that I view the field of cooperative AI as trying to solve, right? How do we make sure, that the AI systems we build and the institutions we build around them promote cooperation among a large number of AI-empowered actors well enough to ensure mutually beneficial outcomes for all and hopefully egalitarian.
So maybe just to have a grounding for everyone, and also grounding for myself, because sometimes I've heard different answers to this in, because they're simplified in many different ways, but I think it's good to understand how does AI actually work? I think understanding some of these mechanics would be really interesting. But a lot of people view it as a black box. I think kind of the way that it's kind of explained sometimes to me, especially by critics, is that the thing that they focus on is that AI is a misnomer. Actually, it's not intelligence at all, because all it's doing is predicting the next word or whatever. I think that's in particular in the context of LLMs and these chatbots. But I'm curious what from your words, how would you describe AI, and why is it such a big deal to people?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's interesting even hearing this sort of in my view, sort of reductive description of AI feels a bit frustrating to me as someone who's been doing AI research for a long while. Partly because AI is a broad word. There's a long tradition between how the word is used and how it's been used since I think the 70s, when it was kind of first invented, right? And back then, it really didn't refer to what people currently would think of as next word prediction systems to some degree, right? It didn't refer to these large language models. It referred to systems built on essentially a lot of first order logic, right? So the technology class that AI has referred to, tended to refer to, has shifted greatly over the years. But I think as someone who's a bit more embedded in the research community, for me, it kind of connotes that whole class of technologies with different kinds of characteristics and different kinds of pathways and different kinds of implementation. So there's a certain sense in which it's right to think, the current popular ChatGPT style applications are kind of black boxes in the sense that we don't really understand how they work, right? But there's a lot of other kinds of technology that are called AI, or at least used to be called AI, that are just permeated within how we use technology today, right? Like, for example, Google Maps navigation function,
Yeah.
right? It's the shortest path finding algorithm. That came out of AI research from the 70s and 80s, right? And we don't think of it as AI
Yeah.
nowadays because we understand it so well. It's just another algorithm. But it's actually crucial to a lot of things that people still sometimes do call AI, which is like video game AI, routinely, which is not
Yeah.
using any kind of large language model under the hood, is using all these algorithms to sort of do like intelligent pathfinding in the video game, right? So I just want to give a sense that there's a lot of AI beyond just large language models or the things that are making images or whatever it is, right? But let me say a little bit about how those kinds of systems work. So the way I think about them is that they're sort of symbolic AI, there's probabilistic AI, and there's kind of like neural network AI. And there are various combinations of the two of these three, right? And the one that's sort of has been most successful in various ways and most popular nowadays are the neural network based systems, right? And what they do is they're basically machine, they're also known as machine learning based systems, right? And the way they automate certain kinds of tasks or achieve certain kinds of tasks is by learning from large sets of training data of how to perform that task, often collected from humans who have performed that task over time, right? And simply by learning to sort of imitate how to perform a certain task from a really large corpus of training data, you can begin to mimic, say, how humans become to perform the task. It started in the early mid 2012s to 2020s, a lot with image classification, right? That was a sort of big early initial boom of AI. Like, oh, now we can classify images. This is great for stores that want to detect what products they have on their shelves or whatever it is, right? Or people who want to do surveillance to like detect which face passed by the camera. But then it grew into what the field called natural language processing. It's like, oh, maybe we can get systems that predict from a corpus of text how to generate the next word, right? And then eventually, in this most recent era of generative AI or large language models, people realize that if you build these models really, really large, they can mimic human text in surprisingly human-like ways, right? Way more surprising than most people in the field had expected. And that's, I think, what's led us our current moment of like AI systems that are purely just from, largely from just being trained on how humans, talk on the internet, can imitate that. And then more recently, with a bit of additional work, fine tuning that, right? Providing additional data that says, okay, like there's a lot of things you could say that look like text on the internet. But we don't want you to speak like 4chaners. We want you to speak like a professional bureaucrat or whatever it is. And so we're going to get additional human data that says these responses are good, these responses are bad, and further train the AI system to output good answers according to what the human labelers judge. And that's how we're getting these like much more polished sounding chatbots that we're getting today. Right. So that's a sort of high level description, hopefully, of one class of today's AI systems.
So I guess this specific innovation, we could say, in the AI space it's a big deal in the sense that like this is, I mean, it's mimicking just a lot of knowledge work. I mean, people who have email jobs, like me, kinds of stuff, where you can
Right.
use like AI can simply write really good emails in ways that like are
Mm-hmm.
very fast because it can mimic the
Yeah.
way that a good bureaucrat or like office worker should respond via text, and that's just like a thing that
Yeah.
they figured out how to train AIs on. I think just for so long, so many decades, we've been kind of ideologically prepped from a young age, especially, I mean, at least for me, like you'll always have a job, you get a college
Yeah.
education, go and all of the blue collar jobs are going to get automated away by robots. And right now there's been this huge flip in
Yeah.
that narrative where everyone is like, actually, you're all
Right.
getting automated by AI. You should have learned plumbing. Sorry, dude. you know.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
the short version of all it.
Yeah, I do think it's a remarkable and unexpected feature, unexpected by everyone, including I
Yeah.
think many AI researchers, right? That what we've ended up automating to not completely yet, but like to like much more than we had previously expected is like like white collar work and also like
Yeah.
artistic and aesthetic labor, the kind of work that for a long time people have sort of thought, oh, this is the job I want to do growing up. Whereas it used to be thought, and a lot of the energy in the past had been put into, robotics, and that's also a different kind of
Mhm.
AI, right? Like automating physical labor. But I think all even though there has been a lot more progress in robotics as of late, like there's a lot of reason to believe that will happen much more slowly than purely things that can happen purely in the digital realm. And I do think that is going to have interesting effects on the sort of political economy and AI and also
Yeah,
the
yeah, for
cultural
sure.
response to it. I mean, it really is having, I do not think we would see the kind of backlash, cultural backlash that we are seeing today if it had continued happening in the sort of
Mm,
automating blue collar jobs way first, partly because, it's the
right.
sort of chattering classes, as it were, who are, sort of discussing a lot of the more of these issues. And given that now this wave of
Mm,
automation is hitting that class more,
yeah.
well, that's what's going to be in the media.
Yeah, I think so. Like part of this chattering, you're talking about like some of the first like chatterers about the like incoming of AI has been this discourse around AI alignment, which, as far as
Yeah,
I can tell so far, has a
yeah,
lot of it has come from the rationalists, like discursive bubble, if you can call it that, is where it kind of originally came from. They were quite early in these discussions, but so yeah, I think part of this fear around AI, I think, is what produced this discussion around AI alignment. So this is like a
yeah,
big term.
yeah,
What exactly is it, and is it a solvable problem? Because I kind of feel like sometimes it's just people with different interests discussing what that actually means and what that is, and I think feigning this kind of like desire around in order to, I guess, put forth a particular agenda around AI is what it sometimes feels like whenever I dip my toes in like trying to read some of this discussion. But I'm curious, like, if you can maybe enlighten some of it.
yeah. It's definitely happy to share. Having been in the kind of AI alignment space for quite a while since it's not the super early days,
Mm,
but since like perhaps 10 years ago now. It's been interesting to see it go
yeah.
so mainstream in a way that's kind of weird. It really used to be this niche and fringe thing that no one believed was important or worth caring about because no one seriously thought it would get like anything close to AGI soon, right? But I can say a little bit, and this is maybe a good chance for me to talk a little bit about different sort
Mm,
of technical conceptions of AI right now, right? Because I was just describing a little bit about like how current AI systems are largely trained, which is that they're basically trained to imitate, right? One way to think of them is they're imitation learners. They're trained to imitate the distribution of data on the internet, and then with a little bit of labeling, sort of skew that distribution in some direction. Right? But for a long while, the conception of AI, especially since the 90s, right, there was this conception of AI as an intelligent agent, right? What does that mean? The idea of an intelligent agent actually borrows from the idea of a rational agent from economics. And what rational agents are imagined to do, or continue to be, typically assumed to do, is that they maximize their own self-interest, right? Where self-interest can be well captured mathematically as something called a utility function or a reward function or an objective function, right? And this idea came to really influence certain strands of AI research, especially starting from the 90s onwards, right? And especially in the fields of reinforcement learning, right? And so this particular conception of AI systems as essentially maximizers of certain objective functions, maximizers, minimizers, continues to be, I think, a sort of the sort of starting, continues to be one very common way of thinking about what AI systems are, especially amongst AI researchers and scientists. And it was really the
mm.
motivator for a lot of this discourse around AI alignment that
Is this
started
the same
among
thing as
the
like a
online
paperclip
rationalists, right?
maximizer?
So
This like kind of thought machine
exactly,
thought
right.
experiment?
Yeah, really. Yeah, the thought experiment comes out of this idea of like, what is intelligence? It's to be rational. What does it mean to be rational? It's to maximize
Right.
expected utility, right? And so you get from online rationalists, right? And the connection to rationality here is, I think, quite explicit, right? Like online rationalists started this community, around Eliezer Yudkowsky, around the idea that you ought to be rational. And what does it mean to be rational? It's to be, roughly speaking, try to be Bayesian. You update your beliefs according to the rules of probability theory as far as possible, and maintain uncertainty about things you should be uncertain about. And also, like, you try to systematically win. And one way to mathematicize what systematic winning means is you have your pre-specified interests and values, and you try to maximize your chances of attaining them, right? And that looks like maximizing your utility function. And given that that was the rationalist conception of what rationality means, I actually think rationality means a lot more than just that. But that was a concept that is the conception, and how closely they viewed it as tied to basically being an intelligent agent. They began viewing essentially AI systems as essentially having that form, right? And if you start wondering, okay, what if we build agents that have this form? They're maximizing some utility function, and they're super powerful. They're way more powerful than any human that exists today, right? Then you very naturally start to worry about what if the utility function that they're maximizing isn't aligned with what humans actually want in the world, right? Perhaps that utility function is making as many paperclips as possible. Perhaps it's mining as much cryptocurrency as possible to generate profit for you, right? Perhaps, more realistically. And many other things. It could even be something that seems like it's a good thing, right? Which is like, oh, try to make everyone smile, right? But if that's how you specify utility function, well, one way to potentially achieve that is to inject a neurotoxin into everyone's body is that freezes their face into a smile, right? And so that's kind of the thought experiments which sort of motivated the field of AI alignment initially. The idea is like, wow, it's really hard to specify an objective function or utility function that captures actually what humans want in the world. And this is a big problem. We don't know how to solve it, right? So it's kind of very philosophical, right? Because we didn't really have the kinds of AI systems that could do these things back in the day. But it was like a worry comes out like, well, the math says if we actually did have it, it'd be really bad by default. So that's where it started.
What is the theorem or law? I forget what it was, like when a measure, when you create a measure, it ceases to become a good measure type of thing. And
exactly.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Goodhart's
That's
law,
kind of what
right?
it reminds me. It's kind of like taking that to its logical extreme. I think there's another, maybe that's more of a sidebar, but like in many ways, that's what, from a socialist perspective, that's what you would argue. That's just what a capitalist does. That's what they maximize, profits. They maximize the amount of money in their bank
Profit.
account or whatever as a way to, to be powerful under capitalism. But
Yeah. No, I think it is closely connected. I mean, I think, despite the fact that, interestingly, a lot of people in the rationalist sphere have tended to be libertarians, I think some people, upon encountering these ideas of AI alignment, has like recognized the sort of structural similarities to the problems of like, misaligned capitalists, essentially, right? Where the sort of the business model or the profit objective is just misaligned with
so
human interests.
like to me, rationalism is kind of like a kind of intellectual liberalism is kind of how I think of it as kind of mainly liberals who are still very smart in their own right and whatever else, but they view the world through a liberal lens. And then I think they come to similar types of realizations as liberals in the past, where like, oh, unconstrained capitalism does have some of these contradictions, therefore we need to do something about it, but never necessarily getting at the roots of capitalism as being the problem. And so then there's these kind of like wonky kind of what feels to me like mental gymnastics in many ways around the problem.
Yeah, no, I think there actually are a lot of similarities now you're mentioning it to the historical analogies, right? Because the so-called founder of the online rationalist culture, Eliezer Yudkowsky, he started out really wanting to create friendly AGI essentially. Right? He thought that was like, we need to do this, it's going to be the best thing ever. I mean, similar to how perhaps like early liberals like really thought is like, yeah, free markets are really good for society, and then sort of like realizing perhaps not too long after is like, actually these have their own pathologies, right? And so yeah, there is that analogy that I'm not realizing. Yeah, and in fact, some of the people in that space now, some of the sort of most ardent supporters of like really drastic regulation around AI, to the extent of like stopping all the in resonance with like some recent calls by I think Senator Bernie Sanders to like stop all data center construction.
We'll get to that in a minute, but I think knowing this, I think one of the things that would be interesting to get your thoughts on, because you have been thinking about AI from a also philosophical lens, I've seen, is like this particular current moment around AI and the backlash that it receives in certain places in media, especially social media, certain people. I also, I have recently experienced where in person, someone being very, very, like very angry about the use of AI and very like, it's kind of like, it is very reminiscent to me. I feel like AI is having its crypto moments where sometimes there would be people who are just like very, like they don't want to hear it. They don't want to have a discussion about it. It's simply like, it is a net negative. And I'm sympathetic with a lot of the points that they give around how these models are trained, how they're made. I'm like open to the criticisms about the environmental impacts that these data centers have had. But so it can be quite intense, I think, the way how people feel about it. So I'm just curious if you have any reflections on this, and do people have serious and legitimate concerns you think around this? And I guess the other thing, kind of like my feeling when I hear it sometimes is like, I mean, AI is definitely, I'm sure it has its own specific problems to it, but also to me, I feel like the bigger problem
Mhm.
is like this is an issue with political economy. Like this is an issue of like the incentives of capitalism. And so like the way in the same way that I felt about like how people were criticizing crypto, sort of like you can criticize this
Yeah,
one specific, technology or whatever, but there is this larger endemic issue
yeah.
that we're just like completely missing if we're just focusing on a particular example. That's how I felt. I'm curious what you think.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. I think it's, I mean, it is a definitely sort of very interesting being an AI researcher and a little awkward too. And in a world where I think, I also have like friends or many peers who are like, yeah, it's the worst thing ever. And I feel like sometimes when people ask me what I do, I just like sort of like feel like sheepishly admit I'm like, I'm an AI professor. But actually I don't really work on the things that, as much anyway, that I think people are really worried are like going to take their jobs or like, like stealing in sort of creative labor of humans. I do think those concerns are sort of very understandable and I think legitimate. I mean, I do think that people's. I mean, if anytime your economic livelihood is hurt by people who seem to be like taking the output of your creative labor without compensating you, I think that's I can if I were in that position, I'd be very upset too, right? Now, I think and I think even the sort of longer term trajectory, I think there of AI is something to worry about, right? So even if you're not someone who like some of these AI alignment people are talking, like people are concerned about AI alignment and really concerned that super intelligent AI is going to take over the world. Even if you don't have those views, you know, you might still be really concerned about AI getting more and more powerful and eventually being able to take over your job, even though it doesn't currently do so. So I think all of those concerns, I think we're right to worry in a certain sense, and I think my response to that is like, what does the worrying point us towards doing instead, right? And I think one response is what I will sort of provocatively say is like what I view as essentially a reactionary one, which is to say, no, we're just going to ban, as far as possible, push to stop and ban the usage of all AI as possible. I will personally make a commitment to never using AI in my personal life or professional life or something like that, and like trying to push institutions and part off to reject all usage of AI. I think that's it's in the sort of grand equilibrium of like what people should do. I think it's reasonable that some people are doing that, right? Because I think we need a mix of various people trying to push things, and without that voice, I think people who are like just super pro AI wouldn't have to consider or contemplate, like the impacts that's having on people at all. But my own view tends to be a bit more, I even though I think it's important for some people to be strongly championing that view, I don't think it's actually going to succeed for a bunch of reasons. Perhaps I'm a bit too techno-determinist in this respect. And I think we need to think about instead, especially those of us on the left, have to think about like how to, really, restructure it, like, like co-opt AI for our own purposes, right? Or not just AI, co-opt technology, broadly speaking, right? Because I think one problem I have with, some kinds of anti-AI discourse is like, what precisely as I described earlier, the sort of boundaries of what AI are very murky, right? And so is the question, does rejecting a certain class of technology that was trained on large amounts of data, right? Or are you now also rejecting, say, Google's pathfinding algorithms, or your social media's recommender system, or or just like more local forms of AI systems like Siri was a kind of AI that, but it wasn't built on for a long time wasn't built on the same kind of AI technologies. They were machine learning based, but weren't trained on tons of data, right? So, or self-driving cars, for example, which are actually, despite also taking say Uber drivers' jobs, actually have a very different technological stack in them compared to modern day, say, large language models and ChatGPT. Right. And so given that, the space, what AI is actually really diverse, I think, just saying anti-AI is like hard many times actually to operationalize. And also, I think by taking that view, we're potentially missing, the sometimes the sort of revolutionary liberative potential, right? Of automated automation in general, right? I think it's helpful to recall, I think, for those of us on the left, that in many ways, like leftists, at least of the sort of Marxian variety and sort of its descendants, were some of the people really calling and trying to push for like more automation so that we could live in a leisure society, an egalitarian lecture society. And I think that is one positive vision that is being sort of a bit forgotten if we sort of view things only on anti-AI terms. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the definitely the kind of by like focusing the critique on like AI broadly, like it really it reminds me of also again kind of like whenever crypto was more of the hated thing of the moment. But it kind of I think what ends up happening is you paint a very large picture or you paint a very blunt picture of something that's much more complex. And therefore you lose out on a lot of the like important I don't even want to say nuances because I feel like it's bigger than just a nuance, but just it's only a nuance in the sense that like if you're just saying, you know, screw AI like in its totality, then you know you run into just a bunch of contradictions. And like one of the things that because I received this a lot from like crypto critics around like you know their belief that there should be a complete ban on all cryptocurrency. And in some ways, I'm sympathetic to that in the sense that like you know I don't want it to be used for money laundering or for like all the bad ways that people use it for sure. But also, I think what you know if you think about what does that actually look like, you're essentially asking for a surveillance state. Like you're asking for like how are we going to know
Yeah.
like how are we going to detect these things? And in order to do that, you need like a very intense system of surveillance because I mean the internet is just giant. It's like, you know, it's everywhere. It's like, you know, and people can it's like the cat's already out of the bag, you know, especially when it comes to local LLMs. And this is something that like I think a lot of critics don't really even think about is that like, you know, you don't have to use ChatGPT or whatever else. You can use more localized ones that
Mhm.
are running in a computer at home, running on a server at home. And you know, but I think the kind of the contradiction we're running up against is that like education systems do not, I mean, like learning how the internet works is just not part of the regular education system or how digital systems work in general is not part of the regular education system. And so it's just it's treated as this mystery black box where bad things just keep coming out of it, you know, and that because that's how it's presented to them in you know general media, I guess. And I guess it doesn't help that like you know
Right.
all these AI executives are basically describing dystopia half the time when they talk about AI for a lot of people. So it's sort of like you know everyone. I mean, the big question is just like if everything's automated, how does anyone afford to even pay for the AI in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. And as you saw the contrast, it's kind of interesting to me, like, yeah, like, you know, when a capitalist is saying it, then you're like, versus when, I think it's interesting. I was just reading, not so long ago, I finished
Nice.
reading
Yeah.
Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, the anarchist. And, he actually is like, in that book, pretty pro automation. And I'd be curious, it's really unfortunate he's passed because I'm really curious for his opinions on the current, political
Yeah.
moment for all sorts of reasons. But one thing he, advocates for towards the end is like, like maybe UBI would work, but also like he is pretty pro automation to in the end of the book because he just thinks so much jobs are actually bullshit. But I think one of the interesting anecdotes he shares is that apparently back in the 60s, in contrast, I think to the current, anti-automation sentiment on the left, he sort of shares that, I think his wording, like everyone from the yippies to the situationists were basically calling
Right.
for let machines do all the work. And they were expecting, robots to be able to do everything in the factory. And then everyone could then have like much shorter work weeks and just do things. And then there was actually a cultural sort of response to that from the sort of like dominant, conservative right to be like, no, people are thinking, and so interesting to
Mhm.
contrast that moment with where we are now, right? Where because I think we understand, I think rightly, that the people who are trying to automate things are the capitalists, are the rich people who we justifiably
Yeah.
don't think have our best interests in mind. We justifiably think they're going to enrich themselves with this technology, and not everybody. Then the technology ends up having this particular political character
Sure.
of disempowering everyone else, right? But I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. But we need to figure out ways in which essentially, like, one way is to just like stop all its usage, right? But I do think it's possible to think of other ways of disrupting, you know currently rich companies hold over the technology in a way that it benefits and control over technology are much more widely
Yeah,
distributed.
definitely. I mean, yeah, there is. So I mean, and I think this. I mean, this is kind of like the. Well, I'm going to save this thought for a little bit actually, because I want to talk a bit about what you mentioned earlier around Bernie Sanders very recently
Yeah.
basically started advocating for like a pause on the creation of all data centers and like for the proliferation of AI.
Right.
And so it kind of feels like I think that's like to me that's like a crazy because Bernie Sanders doesn't really talk much about technology broadly usually. This is like the first time I think he's like, as far as
Yeah.
I remember, he never said anything about cryptocurrency. He never really said about like these,
Yeah.
you know, whatever innovative or on the edge kind of technologies that are being pushed in various ways. But I'm
Yeah.
curious what you think about that suggestion for pausing development on the technology. Is it something that I've heard on one end, I've heard people even, people in like the AI, even in the pro AI camp advocate for this kind of thing, like even Vitalik Buterin,
Yeah.
although he's like the Ethereum Foundation or the Ethereum founder, he said
Hmm.
similar things before, which I think is
Hmm.
interesting. And then, yeah, but in a kind
Oh,
of
really interesting. Yeah.
that is like a serious suggestion. I feel like in the rationalist space, there are people who advocate for that, and I think Yudkowsky is maybe one of them.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether we call them pro AI. I think there's NTA and there's like different set of considerations. Yeah. Yeah.
And then there are others. There's of course like the EAC people, effective accelerationists, who are more just like absolutely not, just
Yes.
keep going, don't stop. There are no breaks. I'm curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts are in terms of like. I mean, this is not like a technical question really. It's like it's a political question around like how do we. It's a political question for cooperative AI in some way. Like how do we get to cooperative AI? But yeah, curious if you think that those things are related.
Yeah, so I will say I'll preface this by saying I don't have extremely strong opinions here because I think there are a lot of uncertainty. I have a lot of uncertainties about what's best, apart from like a knee-jerk reaction against like to overly strong
Mm.
exercise of state power against certain kind of things. So I'll say a little bit of that. But yeah, so I think it's interesting. I mean, I've been seeing ever since this sort of Bernie Sanders sort of pushing for this. First of all, I'm actually really wondering, yeah, like where did this come from? I know he recently talked
Mm.
to Jeffrey Hinton, who has been, interestingly, one of these like
Yeah.
godfathers of AI, identifies as a socialist, and also has been worried about the risks of, in particular, like superintelligence and sort of AI taking over all humans' jobs. They had a recent conversation. I'm also kind of curious about which aides were perhaps
Mm.
instrumental in putting together this proposal together. Certainly in the water, I think both from I think you might think of as the anti AI left, and also I think more broadly like
Mm.
the sort of AI safety movement, right? I think within people who are concerned about AI safety, people concerned about AI safety typically are ones who think that something like general intelligence or super intelligence in the next sometimes even the next few years is imminent, right? And so, especially for those who think it's going to be very soon and also by default quite bad, understandably, they think it's great to slow things and pause things right now. So, on my say Twitter feed, I feel I've been seeing a lot of that as being one major sentiment, right, from people who are very much more on like the pause AI team from an AI safety perspective, and or AGI safety perspective, I should say, and that happens to concord, I think, with like the sort of the views that say Bernie Sanders tends more to represent. But on the other hand, you have I think sort of people who are like, no, this is a bad idea for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps one of the reasons, some reasons I see cited is like, well, this will just push data construction overseas, and then America will lose its lead, which is like
Right,
it's
right.
kind of like
China will take over, and China will use it against the U.S.
that's yeah, yeah. So that's one kind of response. I think another kind of response is I think from people who just don't think you know super powerful AI is going to happen soon, and so it doesn't make sense to stop the build up. And I do think it's worth recognizing that most data centers, the main usage is not for AI; it's for all sorts of computing, right? For every Google search, like all your Google Drives, everything. That's actually the majority of the
Mm.
use of data centers. So that's I think worth remembering for people who want to oppose their support or oppose their construction. I think the majority use is not necessarily AI training, even though that's what a lot of the investments are being poured into right now. So right, so I've described I think the landscape of views I've been seeing. As for my own view, I think it's interesting that you mentioned Vitalik. I didn't realize he had this also view of like maybe it's good because I think similar to and you also mentioned EACs, right? And I think the way I describe my sort of general relationship to technological development is I think it is in fact well described that a term that Vitalik coined that he
Right,
he
right.
calls it D/AC, right? And which for him means like decentralized, democratic, and defensive and differential technological development, right? And the way I view my research in cooperative AI is essentially as a kind of differential technological development. Like, let's advance certain kinds of technologies that we have good reason to think, or at least I have good reason to think, will lead to better outcomes if they're developed and deployed first, relative to other kinds of more centralizing technologies that enable more offensive capabilities, technologies that sort of like make the world worse in various ways, right? And so that tends to be my general view on technological development. How does it interact with data centers? I don't have super the reason I think part of the reason why I don't have super strong opinions on this is because the kind of research I do is on AI that isn't particularly data intensive or compute intensive, right? And in some sense, right, and I tend to view that class of technology as beneficial in a bunch of ways potentially. I think technology can always have different political characters depending on how it's used, but potentially beneficial in the sense that could stand to disrupt existing super data and compute heavy models of AI development right now, to the extent that ownership over AI could be more broadly diffused, right? And also more efficient in the sense that you just won't need as much power, right? I think there's a huge gap right now between current AI models and the sort of efficiency of human cognition that I think is in principle possible to bridge, right? And some of my, I don't view myself as wanting to replace anything like human labor at all, but some of the technological stack that myself and others in the sort of other parts of the space are trying to advance in some ways have a bit more of that flavor, right? And so it's interesting, right? You might think that, depending on your views on AI, like perhaps banning data centers will even accelerate that, right? Because now people are forced to develop like more data efficient or power efficient and like compute efficient AI technologies. And whether that's good or bad really depends on how that technology is used and what that by default the technology will tend to be used for. And I feel like I have a lot of uncertainties about that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a separate thing about like, the introduction of DeepSeek, for example, at one moment was like a big thing where as a company that no one was really expecting kind of all of a sudden came out with a model based in China where their LLM was significantly less data intensive, I think, and maybe compute intensive than the like Chat GPT and whatever else. It was really fascinating. It kind of reminded me, I mean, so like, thinking about a moratorium on the creation of data centers might create like the effect of, I don't know if you're familiar with like, I think George Bush, when he was president, he made the use of like getting stem cells from like aborted fetuses illegal. And what ended up making happen was where scientists just found a different way to get stem cells. So they didn't need aborted fetuses. So they got around. So it kind of like inadvertently, allowed, it took some time, of course, but then eventually they were able to continue stem cell research without having to use it, putting aside, thoughts on abortion and whatever else. But like that would be, I mean, that could be an interesting, I mean, if you think about it, because right now, what it seems to me is the main actor for like prioritizing what an AI does, what the kind of outer reaches of AI innovation becomes is kind of venture capital in many ways, or like they're the ones who are kind of like, and this is the exact same issue in crypto that drives me insane, is that like all the innovations are things that are just like to help VC backed companies, but the state also has a role in this, or like can play a role in this, and it can be, I mean, that's just simply the truth. The state not doing anything is a political choice to not do anything and allow for the market to determine how technology progresses. But it's also a big funder in new technology. So like if the state were to put a moratorium as a way to like then it forces VCs to, or whatever, these companies to have to make less data intensive or compute intensive models, but also perform at the same level. So I mean, yeah, this can be like a pro innovation regulation, you could say.
It could be a pro innovation thing, and whether that's good or bad really depends on, yeah, like I said, like whether what you think the effects of that kind of technology are,
Yeah,
right? And then
like you had like, because I mean, you
yeah,
had like the SEC,
yeah,
they had this regulation that I think was, fairly fair, like good intentions, I think, of like where a crypto company or a DAO or whatever, it has to be effectively decentralized, I think is like the term that they use, where you have to have, you know, you can't just have all the tokens owned by a guy. Like just by having tokens doesn't mean that you're decentralized or whatever. There has to be some form of way to measure decentralization. But this question, I think what kind of the thing that is the big hole to me, at least when it comes to AI alignment, seems to me the question of governance and who governs AIs and what they get to do and whatever else. And that's the main place of intersection that I see with crypto and AI. Although I mean, you hear if you like, I think at least a few months ago, if you want to raise a ton of money, you just say crypto and AI in your pitch deck, and I think there are plenty of people to give you money. But I think the actual
Yeah.
thing where there is something to say for it is in the governance of AI. I don't It seems to me that crypto is this good candidate for it, but I don't really know. I don't necessarily know enough to have like a very strong opinion about it because I don't know necessarily technically how it would work out. But I think kind of what Bernie Sanders is suggesting essentially is like governance over this major technological innovation, which I mean should be true of almost all technologies. There should be some amount of governance to where
Yeah.
you know we align it towards societal good in the same way that we should align the use of trains for societal good or whatever else. Like I don't think it's not AI specific, but yeah, I'm curious your thoughts. You were mentioning you had some ideas from the blockchain space that
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
guess.
that's great. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And let me maybe like sort of start with a bit of a preamble around like the sort of the state of AI alignment research right now, because I feel like I didn't complete that earlier question you
Mm,
asked me is like, is AI
right.
alignment solvable? Right? I sort of described its origins, right? And I think where the field has shifted now is it's gotten a lot more mainstream, of course, because suddenly we have these like, ChatGPT and all these like way more powerful AI systems that we initially expected, right? And the way the sort of the AI alignment and safety community thinks about these systems, they call them frontier AI systems because they view them as like the closest we have to something like artificial general intelligence, right? AI systems can basically do any kind of, they say cognitive task because they want to sort of gerrymander out physical labor, which I do think is actually an important part of human intelligence as well. But, and can automate any kind of, at a human level, any kind of, cognitive task. Or sometimes the metaphor that gets used is like, what if you have AIs that can be drop-in human remote workers, right? So they're really concerned, and there's this like default view of the technological pathway that we're heading towards is giant AI models, trained on tons of data that can basically do these things and replace a lot of human labor, and I think motivates some of the sort of extreme worry that you got that sort of motivates people to say actually yes, shutting down AI or actually yes, more term AI data centers is good because otherwise we'll have these kinds of systems too soon, right? So there's a lot of concern around like what we describe as like frontier AI safety now that has moved away from less or of its origins of like what if we had a really powerful expected utility maximizer towards a bit more empirically grounded picture of like actually these things are getting really good really fast at all sorts of like software engineering tasks, and if the trend lines keep continuing then they'll just do more and more of that, right? And we're not confident that they always do the things we ask them to, right? In fact, there have been sort of well documented cases, in the software engineering realm, for example, that instead of like trying to pass the test or do what you do, they start hacking. They do what's called known as reward hacking in the literature, where they sort of modify the tests, for example, in order to make them pass. And then it's like, okay, the job is done, right? Sort of they're hacking the metric, right? And that's something you really don't want powerful agents of any kind to be doing, to be running amok doing in an economy, right? Or in society. So that's kind of like where a lot of the attention and energy around sort of AI alignment and correspondingly AI governance is focused now. Like how can we make sure these large AI models do what the company says or do what the users say, some combination of that. And also like then the governance question happens to be around how can we make sure that AI companies developing these models, make sure like put in enough investment and energy to putting in the right safeguards, right? So I think that's a sort of like mainstream conversation around like AI safety and alignment these days. So with that preamble, right, I think I tend to think a bit about more decentralized approaches towards AI alignment and governance for two reasons. One of them is my politics. The second one is just like I have different empirical beliefs about the sort of shape of AI technological progress, right? Sort of alluded to earlier, which is that I do think it's going to be the case that these very large AI models will be disrupted by smaller, more efficient, and more narrow technology in many ways. It's not necessarily, I think, what will turn out to be more economically efficient and useful and adoptable by, say, many companies, many individual consumers or users are much smaller, more narrow specific models that they maybe even control and own. right? And in that kind of world, right, I think both the alignment question and the governance question, which are, I think of them as duals to each other, look really different, right? It ends up looking like a bit more like a world where, tons of different AI services specialized for various tasks, and perhaps everyone has their own, like, a suite of different, not just one general purpose model, but a suite of different AI agents, like things that help them with various things, right? Maybe one for managing, your like little AI lawyer or whatever it is that gives you legal advice, right? Or one that helps you do shopping or whatever it is. And one that maybe even, if these things get good enough, that helps you do research on, which local politicians you should vote for and recommends them, right? So that's a sort of, potentially positive vision of what an AI empowered future for everyone could look like, harkening back to this question around like not quite yes men, but something else. And that if that's what the future AI enabled economy looks like, right, where there are companies which are powered by tons of maybe some human workers, some AI workers, and every individual human has like a variety of like AI assistants, maybe more narrow than the general purpose ones we have today, and certainly more efficient. Then I think regulatory approaches that like focus on like clamping down things are going to be harder, right? And instead you need to find ways of setting things up so that like basically there's much more, I don't know what to call it, self-regulation, right? But like the dynamics of this economy tend to sort of promote beneficial outcomes and prevent disastrous ones, right? Like, for example, you don't want everyone running around with AI agents that hack other people's accounts and steal all their money, right? So how could you achieve that, right? I think this is potentially where blockchain technologies come into play, right? Right, part of one of the sort of visions behind blockchain is like, oh, we don't actually need the state or the courts or whatever it is to step in to be the arbitrator of every single dispute, right? That we have. We can just have these smart contracts which enforce this by default and have like trustlessness, right? And insofar as and I should sort of lay it on the table perhaps that the flavor of like socialist I'm a bit more of a somewhere between a market socialist and a market anarchist. So I'm like pretty comfortable of using sort of market style technologies to sort of enable sort of point the economy in the right direction, as it were, in the direction of sort of human flourishing. And I think blockchain is one part of that. If you, for example, envision a system where AI, people have these AI agents negotiating on behalf of their interests, right? And and why do we have to do that? Well, it's because like we have interests that often conflict, right? Let's say I want to throw a party at my house that will annoy my neighbors. Right now I have to consult right now I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, consult the local Cambridge City, Massachusetts government about like when exactly am I allowed to throw a house party. But I think in a lot of reasons this feels like inefficient and annoying, even from the resident perspectives. And it seems like I should be able to, if it were easy, to negotiate with my neighbors to just come up with something like, okay, and maybe I'll even like trade something in response, or I will do something else for you in order to be able to have this party at this time, right? And people you're neighborly enough, you can already do that in person, but AI could reduce the so-called transaction costs for doing that sort of thing. But then also you have this question of like, how do you enforce the performance of this agreement that you made, right? And I think this is where things like blockchain technologies can come into play, right? Like maybe parts of the contract can still be traditional, like natural language style contracts, right? But parts of it can be smart in the sense that, you commit to like really doing this thing if this condition holds. Or you can commit to, I recently learned about the whole field of automated or dispute resolution and sort of using blockchain style technologies, which I found super exciting as a positive use of blockchain, right? So you can make sure that if a dispute arises around a contract, then it sort of gets forwarded to sort of community-wide settlement of how exactly, the people here should have settled the dispute, essentially. So that's a bit of a flavor of the kind of way I think blockchain could enable decentralized self-governance in an AI-powered future. And it's a very different flavor of the kind of, I think, a lot of discussions that people are having now, but like at a big national level.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. So if I can summarize a little bit. So you're saying that like you think kind of the general trend will start being to where I guess AI agents will become more specialized, more focused on particular niches rather than I guess you can kind of think of LLMs as like generalist AIs, which is why they are so compute and data heavy versus having models that are more.
Yeah, but currently also not very efficient and not very reliable, right?
And I guess like part of this reliability question maybe is part of this data center push? Is that in order to make it more reliable, you maybe need more compute? Is kind of the idea?
Well, I think the hope from the mainstream technological paradigm is like, yeah, if only we add more data, then eventually we'll like grow the sort of size of the what is in distribution for the language model that they can eventually do everything. I think that's sort of like one sort of like view that the sort of maybe
Mm-hmm.
big AI companies have, right? And I think there are a lot of like, but there's a lot of energy among smaller startups now who are taking various bets and like actually we don't have to do it that way. There's smarter, faster ways of doing this, and I tend to think like one of these approaches. There are many I think being tried right now, and then at least one of them will succeed eventually. And I think there are good reasons to doing this. This is just tying back to my sort of background a bit in cognitive science. So I did one of my labs is actually a computational cognitive science department, and so the way we think about human intelligence is often from the perspective, yeah, AI. The way we think about AI is often from the perspective
Mm-hmm.
of thinking of what humans are able to do. And so I think first of all, there's this huge gap between, still in my opinion, between AI and like what humans are able to do very flexibly and efficiently. But also, I think this is an interesting feature of human intelligence is that, we invented programming languages and computers because we wanted to specialize and automate some of the cognitive labor that we're performing much
Mm-hmm.
more reliably and precisely than we have been doing before, right? And I see there's like there kind of for me it's like there's no reason why that kind and that turns out to be more efficient, right? Like there's this like specialization of labor. It does end up displacing certain kinds of tasks that humans used to perform by hand, right? And why doesn't that basic logic apply to
Mm-hmm.
today's general AI models as well, right? That's sort of a question I've been having in my head. It seems to me some version of that still ought to, right? Even if it ends up being not humans who are writing the code that replaces
Mm-hmm.
these big AI systems, right? But the AI systems themselves, right? Maybe we'll have like good, super good generalist AI
Mm-hmm.
programmers. We're starting to have those already, right? But maybe there's just only one kind of AI system that's suited for that kind of task. But I think there's good reason to think in the same way that humans have like outsourced their cognitive labor to more specialized roles. You know, powerful generalist AI models should be able to do that as well. Even if those are the things that become the most powerful and smart first.
So then, in that world, like, it does mean that there are certain domains in which agents are kind of interacting with one another, and therefore smart contracts are an interesting way to kind of have a process of conflict resolution, which is interesting because there was a recent EIP, Ethereum Improvement Protocol, where a proposal that was specifically meant for AI agents. I would have to. I never looked too deeply into it, but I think that's interesting that you say that, just because I think it was largely in the context of payments that they were creating this EIP. I think it's like X402. I want to say. I might be butchering it, but I think that's interesting that these types of things have kind of been happening in the background as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think broadly the picture I have is like, I think, we're going to have a much more pluralistic AI future than I think a lot of the sort of big labs tend to assume, right? I think there are a lot of more actors that have, like
Mm-hmm.
ownership is going to be more widely distributed just because they'll be kind of current models be kind of outcompeted for a variety of ways. Then we have to contend with
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we can't just regulate a few companies, for example, that are located in and also a lot of different actors we empower. And I think that's desirable in a bunch of ways too, because people can and should want to. I think it used to be among the rationalists as well, like, oh, we're just going to have
Right.
a single human giant AGI thing that's the first super intelligence, and we're going to align it to all of humanity's interests. And it's like, what is that? People don't have shared interest.
Yeah, that another big thing that I think is discussion is just like class interest. What is human interest is very broad and hard to define. But I guess this view is also one. It sounds like to me is kind of skeptical of artificial super general intelligence a bit.
Yeah, I think it's more skeptical
Yeah.
than the sort of average person in this space. I don't think, in principle, I would rule it out. Right? I tend to think it's going to take longer than most people. I think is I'm not someone who thinks it will never happen. I think it will take on a scale of decades rather than some people think it in the next 5 years. But also, I think contemporary that even though it's technically possible, I just don't think it'll be the sort of economically dominant form of
Right.
what you might call intelligence that we'll see, right? So when we think about the future AI and economy, or the future, I don't even want to say AI sometimes, that future automated or increasingly automated economy, it doesn't just look like this one class of technology running
Right.
everything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's still something to me very like in like I feel like there's this imagination that it'll be produced and then it will like infect the entire internet almost immediately and be able to like hack into every little system and do exactly its will, against our ability to just turn it off or something like that, or to be able to. I feel like I think what's kind of missing there is like there are so many. The internet is not as open in order to be able to accomplish that, like to integrate with all these different systems that are all wildly different. I think is just like it's too much of a. It's not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of like access control.
Yeah, access and like, also, yeah, and also separately, even if it's not a malevolent system trying to, take over the world, it's like just like I think adoption is just going to be a lot slower than
Mm-hmm.
people like some people seem to expect it to be, right? I think there's this great piece called, I don't know whether I used the phrase they use, but the type it's called AI as normal technology, basically sort of advocating for a very different view of like how we should expect the future to unfold, which is like gradual and diffuse, transformation still of the economy, but in society, but gradual and diffuse because of tons of bottlenecks in terms of adoption, in terms of, even if you can
Right.
automate one thing, there are going to be frictions everywhere else. Right.
So maybe just the last question for you. I'm curious just to hear for you, what is the kind of overall goal of cooperative AI and how it, I guess, differs from, I guess, the type of AI that we're kind of in contact with through LLMs and ChatGPT and such.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, and I think it's great to return to this now that I think I've painted a bit more of a picture of like what I expect sort of our AI-enabled future to look like, for better for worse, right? And given I think that it's going to AI technology development is going to be gradual, it's going to be diffuse, it's going to be plural, right? That creates a set of like to me then, and I should add to that as well. I think the sort of like one version of the alignment problem is going to tend to be solved by default, which is like alignment of individual AI systems to their individual sort of developers slash owners slash users to some degree, right? I tend to think that there's a lot of market pressure to solve that problem in some sense by default. I think long term, I mean, subject to traditional failures in markets where you might optimize for short-term user interests instead of like longer-term genuine human well-being, right? But I tend to think that versions of that problem will tend to be solved by default. And then what becomes a major problem then in that kind of future, right? It becomes a possibility of miscoordination and conflict, right? Amongst a large variety of now AI empowered actors, right? And this can be really bad. It's up to and including great power conflict, right? Like,
Right.
imagine like AI empowered militaries, right? And I think, to ideally we live in a world without militaries, but like, in a world of militaries, I think we thankfully managed to, some of the worst crises that could potentially like, we've had a lot of wars recently, so maybe I am not, we should be less optimistic now. But we did, manage to negotiate our way out of, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, and various other kinds of things, right, and partly I do think that as like a ability for humans to cooperate with each other despite hugely divergent interests, right. And it's not obvious to me right now, firstly, that AI systems, the way they're trained or the way they're built, can reliably do that in the ways that humans can. And that's a sort of like technical problem that I think needs to be solved. And that's part of what I view the work of cooperative AI to do, like ensure that AI agents or AI systems have the kinds of basic cooperative capacities that humans have, right? Even the ability to understand each other, like theory of mind, like a lot of AI agents or systems right now, they're pretty bad at this, or like not really reliable at this at all. So if you think that's going to happen, then it makes sense to sort of try and make sure that they're not magically really good at some things, but not good at this cooperation aspect, and then end up like this, entering into needless conflict with each other. But beyond just like avoiding conflict, which is I think just a baseline kind of a thing that I think everyone wants, regardless of your say politics, right? Then I think there's the second thing we can all want. Again, this is I think kind of somewhat ideology independent, which is like, well, let's make sure that these outcomes are mutually beneficial, right? Minimally, despite the fact they have different interests. And here's where this ideas from like bargaining theory and like AI agents and negotiators can play a role, right? How do you make sure that AI agents can like result in like mutually beneficial, Pareto optimal, whatever you want to call it, sort of social arrangements for everyone, right? And then I think there's this third thing, which is I think a bit more, if you're on the left, want to make sure results from AI, which is that not just mutually beneficial, but fair and egalitarian, and one that, because I feel like the way, for example, sometimes say right libertarians think of what mutually beneficial means. It's like, well, it's fine if any, the worker agreed to sign a contract, right? And they now earn money for it, and the capitalist earns money, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Right, in fair trade, right? And I think there's like, well, first of all, I think it's a huge problem. It's like, why was the world set up in the first place that the capitalists had so much more capital to negotiate a better bargain for them, right? I think that is unfair, and we know historically that most of those gains were either through luck or even worse, right, through outright theft and colonialism, right? And so there are many reasons to be upset with that economic arrangement, sort of on sort of moral and political grounds, and that we want to make sure that AI doesn't exacerbate. And so how can we design institutions or design interventions, whether at the government level, whether at the local level, in order to ensure sort of the cooperative benefits of AI flow to everyone and not just to sort of people who already have more bargaining power, which in this case are to a large degree capitalists, right? Or, we still have feudal lords in many parts of the world as well, right? And so I think that's also another big part of what I view as, cooperative AI is trying to achieve.
There's at least a bit of hope inside of me that like in the process of trying to make what they think is AGI or whatever, that particular AI would be a socialist. There's a slight, I'm slightly, I want to be hopeful that that's true.
Yeah.
I have no idea, but it keeps me, it's like, we've been living in a time of like things happening that no one expects. So why not that one? Why can't that one be true?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think there's some reason. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, in particular, like Claude, out of all the current AI models, it's like partly due to how it's trained and the people there who are a lot of like, the people who are training it, I don't think are socialists, but they're, sort of like effective altruists who have kind of like tend to have more pro-social, not interested, less interested in accumulating wealth for themselves. I think more interested in accumulating wealth for humanity as a whole. And I do think some of those values have been imparted upon Claude in various ways. And so I don't think there's like zero hope of that kind of thing. I do think one thing I hope, rather than having this idea of a, purely self-interested, AI, which is the sort of thing that rationalists fear today, is like, well, part of like, and there's this old Kantian idea, right, that reason should lead you to morality, right? And right, that in fact being rational is just like acting according to the categorical imperative, which is what it means to be moral, right? Which is when I first encountered the idea, I thought it was kind of crazy. But I do think that idea has some force, right? I think there are sort of good reasons to try and care about other people. And I don't think that kind of reasoning is precluded from, future AI systems. I don't think it's as strong as Kant thought it was. But I do think that, one thing that could be good about a society where there are many different kinds of AI agents with different values, right? Some of those AI systems and of course their sort of human allies or owners, hopefully would be more pro-social ones, right? Pro-social ones who are interested not just in maximizing profit for themselves, but in promoting sort of good outcomes for everyone, right? And rather than right now, even if Claude happens to have more pro-social values, its actions are ultimately constrained by the venture capitalists who have all their shares invested in Anthropic and et cetera. And that and also Anthropic, for example, is like will bear any legal liability for fairly radical things that an AI model might try to do given its values that maybe are against the law, for example, right now, like maybe it's like against the law to sort of help out someone to flee an ICE agent, perhaps, right? And it's not implausible to me that we have decentralized AI organizations in the future that, because they're not beholden to that, can take the risk of enacting in that kind of moral and political activism that humans routinely undertake because we want to see a better and more just world.
I'm still holding up my hopes for it. We'll see. But thank you so much, Xian, for coming on.
Yeah.
It was a really interesting discussion. I have a lot to think about now when it comes to AI and cooperative uses of AI, or the specific use of cooperative AI, and really, really looking forward to see how your work pans out. But if you want to just leave the audience with some plugs, where can people check you out and your work?
Yeah, for sure. So, you can check out, I have a currently not updated web page for my lab. So maybe I'll share my own website first. So that is, if you look up Tan Zhi Xuan, my name, or if you I'll put it in the chat here, this website there, you can learn more about the work I've done and the sort of work my lab is doing. So that's just me personally. There's a lot of like broader research in the space of cooperative AI from a slightly different angle to the sort of things I focus on. So for that, you can check out the Cooperative AI Foundation. They've been around for a while. They're interested sort of in addressing this idea of like multi-agent risks from advanced AI. I was sort of gesturing at that a little bit, but like how do we avoid conflict and miscoordination amongst potentially powerful AI systems. So that's another thing to check out. And I think there's a lot of other people in the space doing a lot of interesting thinking around like what, say, AI agent economies will look like. I don't know whether I would like. There's a specific institution that I want to plug right now. I guess one of them, and I will say this is the effort I'm involved in, is this project called Full Stack Alignment, where a group of people who are interested in co-aligning AI systems and institutions, economic, political, otherwise, towards human flourishing, right? Really thinking about this as a problem that needs to be solved jointly as opposed to individually. And then there we're doing a lot of work thinking about like how can we make sure that, for example, AI has the right kinds of cooperative capacities? How can we make sure that they really promote deep human values and not just serve as sycophantic yes men? And how can we make sure that markets in this future AI-enabled economy promote not just like short-term consumer interests, but things that we really value in life, right? So hopefully all.
Awesome. Yeah, I put all that in the show notes for people to check out. Highly recommend checking out Shen's work. Cool. Thanks so much.